So, have you ever heard the story of the handless maiden? Her father makes a poor bargain with the devil and unwittingly exchanges his daughter for endless riches. But the devil can't quite get to her, even after ordering that her hands be cut off by her own dear dad. She leaves. She embarks on a journey into the wild unknown. She meets a king. She loses him. She has a baby. She finds her tribe. She grows back her hands. She finds her king, and she lives happily ever after. It's a tale we all have the opportunity to live into, one of betrayal, violation, confusion, deception, and sweet, triumphant reclamation that would have never been possible if not for the darker days that preceded. Your story is no different. Navigating your heroine's journey requires that you walk in the dark without a map. The truth is that you already know how to, and my hand is reaching out to remind you. I am so excited to announce my latest book on the subject called The Reclaimed Woman. It's available for pre-order now, and if you head to the link in show notes, you can learn more about bonuses, events, and companion offerings. And I would be so honored to meet you on the path. I'm Dr. Kelly Brogan. You may know me as a New York Times bestselling author of a book with an exploding pill on the cover, renegade psychiatrist, pole dancer, or honorary member of the Disinformation Dozen. What can I say? I'm a born provocateur. I've spent most of my recent life exposing deceptions, connecting dots, and discovering the secret places my inner victim is still waiting to be liberated. And now I feel called to help you reclaim all of your parts, your health, your sexuality, your power, and your expression, so that you can finally truly own yourself. I want to ignite in you that inner knowing and the pulsing vitality that lives beneath your disempowerment, disconnection, and resentment, so that you can audaciously, courageously, and playfully alchemize your struggle into the specific pleasure of who you are. This is Reclamation Radio. Hi, and welcome back to Reclamation Radio. I am Dr. Kelly Brogan, and I am here with Dr. Nicole LePera, aka the Holistic Psychologist. And I have decided that it is important for me to showcase the most powerful disruptors in the realm of what we call mental health or mental illness. That's why I just, got off the line with Teal Swan, and I'm just sort of feeling into who is on my page about the conclusions that we've come to around so-called mental illness, and how has their journey been informed by such different experiences, leading you to very, very similar conclusions. So I'm super honored, super delighted to be in conversation with you. And I want to start, Nicole, at the switch point for you, because like me, you were a card-carrying cult member. No, you absolutely had drunk the Kool-Aid, right? So you were a believer in the pathology-based framework for cognition, behavior, mood-related issues that were causing distress in somebody's life. And you probably fancied yourself in a good position to be able to help them to fix what was wrong with them. And then something transitioned, right? So you had some kind of a light bulb go on. And I would love to showcase that, because I think it's archetypal, right? Like when we get invited to walk our heroine's journey, there's a signature to it. And I think one of the most important things we could do as we navigate is to recognize when we're in one of those choice points and we decide to take the road less traveled. So I'd love for you to take us back there.
Absolutely. And even just thinking back as long as I can remember, probably around high school, where conversations get started in terms of what are you going to do when you grow up? And of course, I was primed and ready at the high school that would set me up for the college to be able to do whatever it was, right, that I had wanted. And what I personally had wanted to do is to become a psychologist, because for me, I was really fascinated in understanding others. Of course, I think it was generated from a desire to understand myself. So yes, I was happily marching forward to be the person that would be able to help others, much like myself, that were suffering. I even have a flashbulb memory, as you were describing, drinking the Kool-Aid, of sitting at my kitchen table then, flash forward now, I was in a clinical program in my early 20s. And I had just, learned the genetic model, and myself, I had struggled with anxiety for as long as I can remember. At that period in time, I was having panic attack after panic attack. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table around my family where I let them know, right, genetically, this is just a chip that is now missing in my brain. I'm very aware of it. And off I am to now find medication. And this is just going to be the story of my life. And of course, I was sharing it with people that, from my perspective at least, shared this similar anxiety structure or framework. Now, of course, flash forward in time, and you, as I mentioned before we hit record, have played a really pivotal role in my transition. So I had a private practice. I was living in Philadelphia, my hometown, if you will, at that time. I'd start to see clients week after week, as I'm sure you know the deal, month after month, and started to feel really, really frustrated, really disempowered, didn't feel like the work I was doing with others was working, didn't honestly feel like the work I was doing on myself in my own treatment rooms was working, until I had a friend who actually suggested to my wife the podcast that you had recorded with Joe Rogan. And we were going on a long road trip. And I'm not one to listen to podcasts in general, definitely not super long ones like that, but something drew me to it. We were on the road long enough and I popped it in. And I'm so grateful, because when I started to hear you speak of the body's role, predominantly for me, that was a huge light bulb, and all of this different understanding of epigenetics and where mental illness and wellness really comes from. For me, that was and I wouldn't call it a cataclysmic transition moment. I mean, my life didn't immediately miraculously change from top to bottom starting that next day, though I was now armed with information that gradually over time, I quite literally overhauled my own life, my own lifestyle, the choices I was making to integrate some more holistic wellness opportunities, to begin to regulate my nervous system. And then very shortly after, as I started to make some headway in this experience of anxiety that I had imagined up until that point, I would carry with me for life. At that moment, then I knew I had to begin to, much like you, speak more holistically, transition the practice that I was working with individuals more holistically, and ultimately arriving where I am now, experimenting in community-based virtual healing platforms to be able to not only increase the accessibility of this information, but really harness the necessity, I think, that many of us are, especially post-pandemic, experiencing in terms of loneliness and needing connection and safe spaces to find those connections.
I'm sure you would agree. And I imagine this is the ripple effect that your work and your platforms have, is that when you are exposed to the right information, but you're a receptive vesicle for that transition, for that transformation, it's like the perfect alchemy, right? So like, it's not like you got anything from that Joe Rogan podcast that you weren't already ripe for. And I imagine that's true. Literally, if somebody sees a meme on your platform, that feels true. And I call it giving permission, right? Like gives them permission, or you permission to diffuse aspects of your identity that are keeping you stuck in these patterns of struggle. And you had a lot of your own, right? So you and I would, I think, both say the same thing about this kind of wounded healer archetype that we fit into, right? So we have our shit, and in imagining that we can save somebody else from theirs, we are discovering like how similar, right, the archetypal aspects of the journey are. And in your first book, you talk a lot about archetypes. And I am, as a psychiatrist, and I know it's the same for you, like the patterns and identifying how the patterns play out is very stabilizing, grounding. And it doesn't mean that we've like cracked the code, but it allows us to orient, right? Like what kinds of dynamics are at play here, and what should I be potentially looking out? What can I choose to be looking out for in myself, right? So I wonder if we can sort of, starting with your experience, like dig into some of these archetypal patterns that you lived and maybe live still, I don't know, that started to inform you about what you're seeing is so like commonly lived by others, right? So you talk about inner child archetypes, you talk about my favorite subject, trauma bond archetypes and relational archetypes, right? And these patterns of dynamics, and even parent archetypes, and that we kind of fit into these different buckets. So like, what do you feel like, based on your experience, you've come to understand is most helpful for people to know in terms of these patterns of relationship that we would otherwise like never even think about?
I think and how archetypes and or patterns, I think that's the most simple way that I think of what an archetype is. I think that they can be greatly informative, like you're beautifully describing, right? They can give us information of our own patterning, of the own ways in which for many of us, we're kind of compelled to act. And I think it can normalize, especially as you start to hear other people identifying with similar archetypal patterns, you can feel a little less alone in your suffering, a little less shameful. Though I think what's really important to understand, of course, I'll go into what I noticed about myself. I very quickly, and back to even this idea of being open for information, I very much met what I call resistance. So even openness, even awareness of my, say, archetypal pattern, that's what I will always cite as the first step of creating change, becoming aware of how it is that we're kind of acting in the world or reacting in the world. Though I will be the first to say that is step one, because step two, the embodiment of new patterns, right? Being open to the information was a huge first step, though those first couple days, weeks, months, when I began to action in a new way, then I really came face to face with the power of our body, driven by our body, I should say, and our desire to stay in familiar patterns, even those that are causing suffering. So for me, it became really clear, like what I saw in myself. And I think we are very patterned creatures. Many of us even call our personality, right? This constellation of patterns that we had to create to navigate the environments and the relationships that we were born into. Some of us become so fused with that we truly believe that is who we are. But as I go into, especially in this new book, where it really breaks down relationships and really understanding the power of those earliest worlds, right? From the relationship to the environment, to the epigenetics of those and our ancestors who came before us, we are so conditioned in a way that I think some of us, we can't clearly see our patterning or we can't clearly break them. And so what we, from how we think about ourselves, what we believe, who we believe ourselves to be, to how we navigate our emotions, to generally who we show up and who we believe ourselves to be in the world is really driven by archetype. And I think even just thinking of me personally, the wounded healer, what I saw in all of my relationships, in my professional and my personal, right, was this desire to become defined by my function, the role that I played for someone else, right? And of course, for me, this, or as it does for most of us, originated in early childhood when I became very clear that I could grab the attention of my caregivers, my mom in particular, when I was, as I would call it, performing. When I was getting the good grades, when I was a star athlete, when I was, right, kind of presenting the family and being the child who would go to the college that would, right, do something with herself. So I became so fused that I did wake up well into my 30s with almost what felt like a hole inside of me as I was becoming clear, oh my gosh, we're patterned who I think I am, right? Is this person who's driven by achievement, though the reality of it is that is truly the only way I knew myself. I didn't know what I thought. I didn't know how I felt. I didn't know what I wanted to do, how I wanted to act outside of moments where I was endlessly, whether directly or indirectly, seeking the validation, whether it was from my partners, whether it was from my clients, whether it was from the world around me. And so, again, I think all of our archetypes look different, but what is very clear to me is how fused some of us can become with them, how some of us only know ourselves in this idea of the function that we play, and then more so how destabilizing it is when we awaken at whatever age that is, and we feel that emptiness, we feel that dysregulation, and our body is driving us, right, almost compulsively back into the old patterns that we falsely created a sense of safety and security around.
I imagine you can relate to this phenomenon I've spoken a lot about, especially recently, that I think presents in women to varying degrees, depending on what they were congratulated for, seen for, acknowledged for in their childhood, right? Where when I would achieve the thing, right? When I would secure the accolade, all of these peak experiences of performance in my life, they would feel hollow, right? And I would have this dissonance that said, like, well, you should be happy now. It happened, right? You got the 4.0, you graduated the place, you got into this program, you have this credential, and immediately my system would train on the next shiny object. And the hungry ghost that is, this starvation for validation which when I think about sort of the yin yang, masculine, feminine dynamics, like I think of as like being a masculine value, right? To feel validated versus like just loved, love for being. And when I think about that, I don't know that there ever would be enough, right? Like how many millions of subscribers or followers, how many millions of dollars, how many important acknowledgements, like, and I think we see this, right? We see this often in people who have these measurable accolades. And I wonder, was there a point at which you started to feel the emptiness of that lifestyle?
Really consistently, much like you, across every moment of achievement, right? The graduation, the award, immediately followed by, if I didn't already know what was going to be next, looking to what was going to be next in the moment, right? Looking, grasping for someone to give me the validation, shamefully feeling like, oh, I should be happier than I am now. And for me, it even kind of trickled into my personal life outside of celebration, right? And what comes to immediate mind is how painfully lonely for me historically birthdays have been, holidays have been, right? These other moments where we're expecting to feel loved, connected, celebrated. And it's not to say that I didn't have many birthdays where I was in a relationship with a romantic partner, where I had access, or friends would come and visit me, or they were in the town in which I was living. So it wasn't that I had absence of relationships in those moments of holiday or of birthday celebration. It was even in the presence. That emptiness for me is probably a somatic memory. While I struggle to recall a lot of the kind of autobiographical details of my childhood, I have a well, if you will, of somatic memories. And what I remember very clearly is a pressure feeling on my chest. And I really do translate that to the deepest feeling of, I would call it a blend of loneliness and of grief that began from a very early time when I didn't have the emotional attunement that I needed. And so continuing then to seek outward, to find myself always with friendships, with plans, with something to do, say on my birthday, but always kind of going back to feeling that whole. And then for the better part of at least 2 decades, watching myself cycle through all of these attempts at self-soothing actions, right? Drinking too much, partying too much, keeping myself too busy, whether with socializing or with accolades, that quite literally, as I entered into my 30s, I hit the wall. And thank God that was at the same moment where I had access to this information. I was ready to receive it. But that was the time when my body was literally beginning to shut down. I lost consciousness. I fainted on 2 occasions. And I think it was just, again, this life of pushing, right? Of kind of the masculine energy of just driving past all of my emotions because I didn't have the attunement, the safe space to learn how to navigate them on my own. And then couple that with all of the self-soothing behaviors that were equally exhausting, living in New York City, keeping myself running from morning till night, then it was the recipe for exhaustion and shutdown. That my first inclination when those symptoms started to happen, before I had this awareness of my nervous system and my body, were scary, if I'm being honest. That was the moment where I thought, oh gosh, here's the moment in time now where I, as coming from a family who struggled with chronic health issues, chronic illness, chronic pain for as long as I can remember, I at that moment thought, oh gosh, I'm now losing consciousness. This must be the moment where now I have the chronic health issue, perhaps wrong with my brain. Maybe this explains why I don't have memories, right? All this was coming together in an alternate narrative that would have sent me down a much different path had I not gained this access to information that allowed me to view not only those symptoms, but really everything we're talking about now, all of this archetypal patterning, right? All of this drive to perform, this deep-rooted hole that I still sometimes feel in my heart. Right now, I have a new explanation and thankfully new empowered choices that don't tell me that old message, the old message of there is no change possible. This is just something you have to live with, right? You're just genetically doomed to this outcome in life. I finally, for the first time, right, saw a glimpse of possibility in a new direction.
I love this. And I think I'm just reminded of one of the many reasons I love and resonate with your work. And I'm so grateful that you're out there doing your damn thing, girl, is that you deliver the invitation to personal responsibility with the like splash of cold water in the face of like a powerful reframe in a very compassionate way. probably way more compassionate than I do in so many ways, right? So when you speak about the role of these imprints and this misattunement that we, you, she, all of us experienced in childhood, you seem to make sure that nobody gets stuck in the swirl of victimhood that can attend a lot of the trauma-based discussion that is in the zeitgeist right now, right? Because you can get to a place where you go from believing I have no choice, there's nothing I can do, it's my genes, it's my heredity, look here, the other shoe has dropped and I'm fucked for life. You can go from that to understanding and gaining insight and even self-compassion around how your needs weren't met in childhood. And you can actually stay in the same energy of poor me, no fair, this sucks, something really big happened to me. It happened in the past. I can't change it. And now I just have to cope with it. To me, that's the same narrative as my genes are broken, right? Or my chemical imbalance is like disabling. So the ingredient of the reframe, right? And the invitation to personal responsibility is how, I think you would agree, you translate that awareness and that insight into actual experiential behavioral change in your relationships, right? And in your lived experience. So I wonder if you could talk about like, how do we not get stuck in the poor me, so sad, I was so traumatized, my parents were so fucked up in all these different ways, and I keep falling into this pattern, I'm stuck in this pattern over and over again. Like, how do we not get arrested there and instead work with that to bring forth change into our lived experience and to feel inspired that like we're here to create the experience we want to have, even though, you know, we have these deep grooves and imprints. I mean, before I hand you the mic, I'll say like, I've come to the conclusion in my relationships with all dimensions, including my business, in my life, that I may just have the same shit my whole life, right? Like I may have the same patterns, the same defenses, the same, you know, kind of like messed up way that Kelly has learned to relate to the world. And what has changed is that there's space inserted where there was previously reflex, and there are choices that I literally didn't know existed before. And that makes for a more fun life, like a more interesting life. And a life where I feel that the locus of control is actually restored here instead of remaining in my trauma, in my genes, with my parents, or somewhere, let alone the medical system or my chemical imbalance, somewhere outside of me. So like, how do you think it's important to support people in the transition from awareness of like how we were messed up, right? Because you're really good at that. Like you're really good at shining a light on all of the ways that we were messed up and to resolve the gaslight that says you should be feeling fine. It's fine. That's in the past. It's not a big deal. Like, and how do you think it's important to move from that awareness into like actual behavioral responsibility and associated change in relationship? And probably, you know, you could speak to also this book. I would love for that, you know, to be a part of this conversation.
I think even just beginning, right, with this powerless, disempowered, right, a victim to whatever it is, the circumstance, the relationship around us, right, from that stance or that space, let me call that space to be in, I want to normalize it first, and then I'll kind of shift into compassionately, hopefully making the transition. And what I came to even see in myself is it's really understandable when we are living, right, a reactive life driven by all these patterns wired into like the lower regions of our brain, right, the emotionally driven, the nervous system driven reactions. It is very natural to feel, as I spent many decades of my life feeling, that the world is happening to me, right? Because things happen out there. And we tune in usually when we're in the throes of an overwhelming emotion and or the reaction to whatever the emotion is, right? And nowhere along, at least for me, nowhere along that pathway did I feel I had, words you've used, your choice, control, groundedness, right? The ability to step back and create a space to say, do I want to be, and do I want this train to keep rolling down this track? So I really do want to normalize like all of this kind of mental mind-body process that's happening behind the scenes that's causing what for a lot of us feels like our instinctive way of being. And then we tune in, right? Mid screaming, yelling, maybe after the fact where we feel shameful. And that's, I think, the moment where some of us at least are starting to be like, oh gosh, like where did that come from? Is that real? And then maybe even some of us entertain, oh, maybe that is really who I am. Maybe I am a person, right? So without that space, what I'm trying to say is it is so natural to believe the world is happening to us because we don't have those points of choice. And then compound that with much like my 20-year-old self at that dinner table, right? I looked around and what a lot of us are surrounded with in the form of our families, right? These relationships and environments in which we were raised, we see so much similar patterning, reactivity, right? Ways of being that, of course, now we feel like these things are just genetically, instinctually who we are. So why would we be able to change? And then maybe even strengthen that even more with, if you're like myself and you have parents that are up in age, my dad is near 87 years old, who then affirm, right? This is just how I am, right? I can't change. And I think that's a very common message that we hear, right? This idea that we just are who we are from birth until death. And there's just a trajectory and no one can shift or change or impact that. And I think that has a lot also to do with the older medical model of genetic determinism, who essentially said just that, right? Things happen, they're going to genetically express themselves or not, and we don't have that say. So normalizing that for me, and even like I said earlier, becoming aware of the patterning didn't immediately give myself space, didn't immediately shift what I embodied in terms of my choices in that moment. Right. I was in a lot of ways that person who, while I had information and I maybe saw other people like yourself who were making these choices consistently enough to change what their life looked like and the reactions or the outcomes that they created, there was still a part of me that was like, I don't know, maybe it's different. Like, maybe it's just not meant for me. So that resistance was still and is still present in moments. So having the compassion and awareness of what's beneath the surface, if you will, like I said earlier, is part of the story. Though, again, this is where it was so and continues to be so foundationally important for me to employ the body, to engage the body, to make sure that I'm building resources from my body, not just from the top down, if you will, because until I learn, right, how to create space, until I learn how to begin to manage overwhelming emotions, what happened for me and will happen for all of us is we will find ourselves back in that old protective patterning, because as stress builds, right, as our nervous system becomes more overwhelmed, we will fall back into the old ways, the familiar ways in which we learn to cope or how we learn to be. So compassion, for me comes when I can see the fact that, and I can give myself the opportunity to make a choice. Doesn't mean that those choices will be easy and consistent in the beginning, but even the possibility, as I learn how to be more conscious to everything that's happening behind the scenes, right? We can become really intimately aware of everything that's creating those reactions the more we pay attention, right? The more I notice that, my body begins to shift and change. There's sensations that are happening. And those are usually kind of coupled with certain interpretations or ideas or thoughts that are running through my mind or beliefs in that moment. And then I can start to, right, see the possibility of difference, right? I can see space where I can begin to make choices to shift how my body is feeling. I can begin to question some of the older narratives or interpretations that might not be as accurate or as beneficial for me in that moment. And then I can begin to make those new choices. But I do believe that with awareness, I should say, comes compassion, because as we see what's driving our behaviors, a lot of us can relieve ourselves of the shame, right? That this is just who I am. I'm not a good person because I do these hurtful things to other people. And we can relieve ourselves of the impossibility of change, again, with this idea that I can't change, right? Because the world impacts me. As soon as I see the very active role that I am playing in creating the world around me, from the way my body is interpreting it, to the way my mind is interpreting it, to then what I've habitually learned to do, then I can start to create that beautiful space that you're describing.
Hmm. So every woman knows that one of the fastest ways to amplify the pleasure that already exists in your body is to get into a luxurious bath. But what if you could program the water with the wisdom and intelligence of flowers while also infusing the space with the sensuality of the most unique aromas available? Lotus Way bath salts are a feminine ritual that drops me into my body in minutes. It's the power of some of your favorite flower essences delivered in a new way. So head to lotusway.com and use the code Kelly15 for 15% off. The link is in show notes for you. The resistance, as you call it, like the energy that is stacked against change, right, is there for a reason and serves us, right, until we are actually ready. And I actually don't ask many people this question, but for whatever reason, I feel like you might have some insights, because for many, many years, I have been paying close attention to readiness, because I've changed many, many times. I've witnessed thousands of people radically change their story. And I want to know, like, what is the fulcrum? Like, what is the point, the tipping point? Like, why is it that you can have the information, you can have the awareness, you can even have the models in front of you, the inspiration, but you don't actually take steps in the direction of change until you're ready to do so? And I wonder if you have any like observations in your own life or in those that you've worked with about like, what is that readiness? Like, why is it that we change when we do? And what is it to just stay stuck in your shit? Like, is that even a problem? Like, maybe it's actually totally fine. And then when you're ready for a different story, you kind of pop over and try on a new identity, and you're ready somatically to hold that, because the prospect of having done it wrong or bad before doesn't really scare you, right? As much as the invitation to try on something new and exciting. But do you have any observations about like what makes somebody ready to work with? I mean, you've written multiple books. Like you think information obviously matters, right? You share information every day on your platforms, and you know that there are more ingredients to change than just the information. So I wonder if you think it is a somatic process, if you think that there is like a community element, right? Like you need people, like you said, around you normalizing this so that you can begin to ripen. What do you think makes us ready to take that responsibility? Because otherwise it can be such a burden, right? To entertain this notion that like, I'm struggling and I'm responsible. Like I've been told I'm a victim shamer, right? So that's one of the many lovely points of feedback I've been given over the years, is that I'm shaming victims. And I could see that, right? I could see how it can feel like, pointing in a direction that's exquisitely uncomfortable when all you want is a rescuer, a savior, and somebody's here saying like, you got you. So what do you think about readiness?
Really great question. And I think readiness is something that is more somatic. I think sometimes it is the catalyst, right? So let me just explain to it. I think readiness comes from within, right? It's a feeling of usually deep-rooted suffering where we have this inclination or instinctive, maybe even idea, thought, hope, maybe even, right? That I can't take this, right? This is pretty bad. Things need to change. I think that is for me kind of the pivotal shift where we might be inspired, whether it's looking for information, looking for support, telling someone how the suffering that we're in. But I do believe it comes from inside. I do think that there can be different catalysts. Some people, right, meet that feeling of readiness, of suffering, of, oh gosh, like something has to change, something has to give because of something outside that shifted or changed, right? A relationship might have ended, a death, a loss, something happened outside. But again, I think, and I didn't necessarily fall into that category, which for me was like, for me, that suffering was, I can't imagine continuing to live a life where I'm spending so much time fantasizing about leaving my life because I'm so exhausted. I'm so drained. I'm getting so resentful of the world around me that I think is requiring so much of me. Even in reality, I was the person requiring so much of myself. But ultimately, again, I think it has to be something inside of us. And I think it begins in a suffering place. It begins in pain. And then I think the natural step is some of us, right, seek information. Some of us seek support. Some of us are greatly benefited if we hear and are exposed to other people on a similar journey or giving information that can be of benefit. But I think internally is where we feel inspired to become ready to change. And I think this, just even thinking in the context of my new book on relationships, I think can be a really frustrating component or aspect of relationship, because a lot of us, especially if we're on our journey, if we're creating change in our own life, as we're continuing to struggle in our relationships, as many of us are, or as we have a different vantage point, we see our loved ones suffering. We see the patterns that are creating their own suffering, and we want to help them create the change that we think can not only benefit them, but likely will benefit us in our relationship with them. So what do we want to do? We want to give them all of our good information. We want to demand they change. Some of us even want to give an ultimatum that they have to change, or else our relationship with them will change. And again, the reality of it is it will need to be that other individual's, right, readiness, internal feeling of desire to even, entertain the possibility of change. It is not something that we can hope or wish for or create in someone else. I mean, we can hope and wish for it, but ultimately it would be, supporting them in their journey. And I don't think it's the trajectory many of us take, right? We see from a different vantage point, someone else is suffering. I think this applies a lot in our relationships with our family members, right? We see clearly the same patterning, the same environment that created maybe what we're working on ourselves. And then we want someone else to become ready at a time when they're not necessarily ready. Though I do think it comes from inside of us, and it usually begins when life has become intolerable, that we do find ourselves seeking support, whether it's information or supportive practices, to even entertain the possibility that we could feel differently.
Totally. Right. So we're talking about like, how does this locus of control shift from the outside to the inside? Because the patterns that we typically get into, not only in health, but in relationships, are externally focused, right? So you alluded to this. So if I'm struggling in a romantic relationship, then I'm going to potentially focus on my partner's behavior, on, his or her, shortcomings and what it is that needs to change out there in order for me to finally be okay. And of course, I don't have control over that. So there I am, resting into that same familiar powerlessness of my childhood, of every, hierarchical system and non-consensual experience of domination that's ever existed in human history. So there I am again in the victim consciousness field. So, I call it staying in your lane, but you have elaborated your work into the realm of relationships, and the messages seems to me the same about the control and power that you have to change the connection and love that's available. And it's like the most annoying message. Come on, like on some level, right? It's like, like, it's just even the title of your book is so perfect and so annoying. And that's like, especially like, several years as like a single woman doing this work of, sourcing from within me and creating the conditions for me to access that which I imagined would only come through the romantic dyad. It's like, I didn't want to go on this journey. So I imagine that most of us who find ourselves reading your book, accessing this message, it's like, we don't even want to be here. Like, we don't even really want to be, learning how to meet our own needs, because it's still so delicious a fantasy to imagine that somebody else might just figure it out, right? Like read our mind, read our system, and just magically deliver. Okay. So like, is there sort of like a ready example that you have of like how it looks in relationship to do this work? Like, how does it look to meet your own needs, to be the change you're looking for, to offer yourself what you imagine could potentially only come from this person who happens to be here? So like, why don't they just figure out how to give it to me? Right. So, and the plot twist is that until and if you have this self-relational skill, you wouldn't be able to receive it anyway, right? So even if it were there, you wouldn't probably recognize it. So I wonder if you could depict for us, kind of how does it look? Because you're a very practical gal, and you live this, and you share examples of like what this looks like in real life. So yeah, in terms of relationships, like what would this work, sort of play out as?
Yeah. And I think back even in my own journey, in my own past, in my own relationships is, being, and then again, normalizing for the large majority of us who do have that hope of someone, right, rescuing us, being the be all end all that can meet all of my needs in any given moment. Right. I do think that's an artifact of our at one time, which was a very developmentally appropriate way to think, right? In childhood, where we did have, and we were completely dependent on someone else whose job was to near be a mind reader in the form of to attune to our nonverbal signals, right? To try and figure out what it is that we wanted and needed. And then so that over time, we could learn how to attune to ourselves. And I think what we're dealing with now is an epidemic of adults who didn't have that type of attunement. So when asked or even propositioned with this idea, as I know I am often the bearer of very annoying feedback and news, it's like, well, no, I don't want to. I don't know how. What do you mean I'm supposed to do this? Isn't this the point of being in a relationship? And again, I want to continue to normalize all of those belief systems because it comes from very real developmental place, one in which many of us still are locked in. And of course, this isn't me as I'm describing myself included, right? I'm not saying that we're, immature in a negative way. It's just we are not developed our emotional systems in a way that can allow ourselves to be an attuned individual, both to ourselves as an individual and to others. So even for me, I think of very early on in my relationships and right, discovering all of the ways in which I relied on someone outside of me to make myself feel whatever it was, to feel grounded, to feel connected, to feel better if I felt bad, right? To whatever it was, to feel something. I even saw in my kind of awareness stage where I just was really an observer. Let me go out and see all of these patterned ways that I'm functioning in my daily life and in my relationship life. And I saw even outside of relationships, all of these ways throughout my day, I relied on external markers from times of day that would determine when I was hungry to eat and feed my body to determine what type of food I would eat. I was usually looking outside of myself. Well, what is everyone else eating around me? There was all of these micro moments where I didn't attune to myself to determine from anything from what my body needed, from nutrition to rest or movement in a given moment, right? I was the person, if everyone around me was doing work or working out, I better be working out or doing work too, because I don't want to be the person who's not doing it, even if my body or my creativity, right, wasn't in that space to do it. So what I then saw in my relationships and the opportunity I gave myself, I almost took a radical approach, right? So I was in a relationship. I began very much with my partner, Lolly. We were very much trauma bonded with all of these, dysregulating patterns that both of us would cycle through from our own childhood. So we were in a relationship and maintained one through both of us changing our dynamics. But what I noticed was, again, how reliant I was on things, people, circumstances outside of myself to be a certain way so that I could feel a certain way. And I wanted to shift that. So I took a radical approach. So I described being in a relationship because here I had someone waking up with me, alongside of me, going along the motions of everything I was doing more or less. But instead of each and every moment, I saw myself, right, going to outsource, to ask someone, to look to someone else for whatever it was, from determining how to physically care for myself in that moment, to determining emotionally what I wanted or what I needed. And I just took time to just take full responsibility. And what that looked like for me was to just focus on me in those moments, right? Before even going and asking or seeing what everyone else was doing, right? Can I take radical ownership of my life, of my physical body and of my emotional body? Can I learn how? Can I explore what it was that I want or what it is that my body needs or how do I feel soothed or comforted in these moments? And so I spent a lot of time almost kind of going from one extreme of total reliance to another extreme of total independence, if you will. And then as I got clearer on me and had created now new boundaries for my physical body, for my emotional body, then I was able to start to teach myself now, because now I had to learn how to vulnerably ask for the actual support that now I'm discovering that I need. And then, to speak to your very wise point, not only how to ask, how to receive it, right? Because I still have that conditioning inside of me that never simply practiced it, didn't have the attuned caretaker. I'm still discovering, right, how to co-regulate in a way that works for me and someone else. So for me, it really kind of meant going into a different extreme until I was able to find myself in a middle, to be able then to receive and give the support that I want and need in a relationship. But first, I needed to create space or boundaries for myself to explore. And of course, along the way, I was very much in active communication. So those of us that are in partnerships, I think the more we can communicate with those around us, especially as we're going to start to exhibit new behaviors or make new choices, it can be very helpful to kind of tell those around us who are maybe wanting to support us what we want or what we need, even if it's as I once did, right? I just need some space to figure out what it is that I want or what it is that I need right now. But again, for me, it took taking full ownership of myself in more what could have felt like a more radical way. Then I was able to kind of loosen my boundary or become a little more flexible. And in doing that, what I was doing behind the scenes is I was creating more self-confidence. I was resourcing my body. I was resourcing my nervous system so that then when I got to that step of now learning how to truly give and receive support or co-regulate with another person, right? Then I was much more grounded and resourced and able to do that.
I've experienced the same exact trajectory. And I think, again, it's archetypal because, when you have that other focus and the pendulum is there. And again, for very valid and good reasons, that strategy works in most of our childhood conditions, right? And the pendulum swinging to self-focus is a scary transition because there's so much loaded judgment around you're selfish, you're self-absorbed. You express, that you need time and space or, put boundaries forth. And it feels like it could invoke so many of these judgments and all the risks associated with those judgments, but only then can you begin to allow the pendulum to come to rest in the connected space, right? Like you soften and mature those boundaries. They're no longer as necessary because you can attune to yourself and you don't have to have rigid rules. You can see what the situation is asking of you. But I always have found in relationally, this accusation of you're so selfish, and especially in a culture that fetishizes the toxic narcissist, right? You're so selfish. What that person is ultimately reflecting is pay more attention to me. You're paying too much attention to you, right? So they're exhibiting the exact mirror of that selfishness. And a lot of the self-inquiry, self-exploration, self-relation that I know you are an advocate for, too many reads also because I've gotten this feedback, it reads as self-absorption. And I think, right, you would agree that phase maturationally is an essential reclamation from the codependent, other focused, I'll give to get patterns that we find ourselves in.
I think somehow brought the developmental trajectory because absolutely. I mean, we think of even those earliest stages of toddlerhood, right? Other people, like those of us who have kids, there is no other person, right? It is this kind of full, it's about me developmental stage, which again, at that time is completely appropriate. We celebrate, right, toddlers as they're beginning to have these boundaries, as they want all of the focus on themselves, as it is all about them in the home, right? That's celebrated because that's a developmental stage that we all need. Though the reality of it is absolutely, as we do that into adulthood, colored by all of our cultural belief systems, I myself have heard very similar feedback, especially. So one of the biggest spaces I've created early on in my own journey was space between myself and my family of origin. Simply put, I cut off contact. I went no contact. And again, there wasn't anything big or egregious or abusive that was necessarily happening in my home. So I have all of this cultural conditioning as well, grounded into me coming from an Italian-American heritage where I was taught how family is everything. Even to this day, I can see in my dad, right, the pain that I cause him because I'm a little bit still separate. I still have a beautiful now connected relationship with the family that I've reconnected with, though it doesn't look in that enmeshed codependent way that at least traditionally it does in my family system. So, and in those moments, those months, I think it was the better part of almost 18 months when I was separate from. And then as I started to speak very publicly about that aspect of my journey, I heard very regularly and consistently everything from how I was urging other people. I'm a family ruiner. I tell people to break up families and everything in between, and how selfish. And I would be lying if I said that there wasn't the voice inside of me that worried and agreed. that was like, oh gosh, Nicole, you are so, I mean, it took me until that moment in time, whatever it was, I think it was that July, a couple of years ago now, several years ago now, where I finally sent what was an email to tell them lay down, because I didn't trust myself to communicate the boundary that I wanted and that I needed, though it had occurred to me multiple times that I needed that level of space before that July. It had started to occur to me that I didn't really want to even continue to live in the Northeast where my family lived. I was being called out West, but all of these moments of separation, I convinced myself out of fear and concern for how it would be for my family. So for me, I was, what I thought I was being selfless by worrying about them. Meanwhile, I was accumulating all of this resentment. I was continuing to play this archetypal role. So quite honestly, I wasn't being my authentic self with them at all. And then I was wondering why our relationships didn't feel authentic or connected or deep, and why at the same time I was continuing to feel exhausted, drained, and growing in resentment for them. Right. And it took me until that point, again, radically taking responsibility, not even requiring or asking them to change at all, when I saw the possibility of me taking that empowered stance of, okay, let me go take this radical space that I need to create the space that I need to begin to explore myself, because I didn't trust my ability to create that type of boundary without kind of giving myself that degree of space that no contact would. And still to this day, so on the other side of it, 18 months later, having reconnected, both inside and outside of family therapy, having seen many different shifts and changes in their dynamic separate from me, in my dynamic with them, and honestly seeing a lot of things that are somewhat similar. What is now different is me and my level of confidence to continue to maintain the boundaries that allow me to show up within the relationships in my family more authentically. And as a byproduct, I now not only feel much more seen within those relationships, I feel much more accepted and supported, even if I'm not doing as, they would like me to do. And I feel much more deeply then connected and authentic with them when I'm in relationship with them. So yeah, I think selfishness is one of the, is a really, it's a tough thing, because some of us are so conditioned with beliefs, that kind of expand even the definition of what it is and what it means to be selfish, where we end up putting every gesture of self-care in this category. And then we really do cause ourselves really deep rooted suffering, even as we're, I think, making shifts and changes that will empower ourselves, because we have this deep rooted belief that what we're doing is wrong, is bad, is shameful. Again, some of us then have the relationships that are reflecting that belief. And then before we know it, some of us are right back in those acts of service to maintain the connections that we think we desperately need.
Yeah. I have a very similar trajectory, also Italian American. And for me, it was 5 years, actually. So you were on the accelerated track of 18 months. And, I don't know how unrelatable it is when we think about any kind of, trauma-informed addiction. Everybody understands that there's an abstinence window. Sometimes that abstinence window is forever, but like at least there is a period where you have an opportunity to find yourself. You take the booze out of your house. You no longer go to the casino. Like what do you block the porn websites, whatever it is. And you remove yourself from the trauma field of all of those familiar triggers so that you can orient to who the hell you are. Like this self-relational journey for many of us begins in our 30s. I mean, I see my daughters as teenagers and I really feel very hopeful, for these nonlinear shifts that can happen generationally that don't require anybody, reading any books or taking any self-development courses to just maintain that self-connection and that inner navigation. But nonetheless, for the rest of us, there is a journey, that begins with that. I call it the big fuck no, but it begins with that rupture, And it's something you alchemize. The most beautiful thing about this work, and I know you'll agree, is like, you don't need to involve anyone else. Like, yes, family therapy. I've also, been greatly served by family therapy. And in the end, I did the damn thing for myself. And I have found that I live in a world of people who are somehow different, even though they haven't done the things I might have, thought were essential for them to do. They weren't involved. And when when I change, these dynamics change. And it's actually delightful because you don't have to coerce, as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter, you don't have to coerce anyone else's, opt-in to your worldview, your spiritual perspective. You just can focus on how you can serve yourself. So, I'd love for you to give, just sort of like an overview of what in your latest book people can access relationally. And maybe I was thinking like, what's like a fun, interesting example of like a habit you used to have in your relationships, that now has just softened. Like now it just kind of is different. Now it doesn't really exist. And I know, that you also are an observer of like all of these dynamics and patterns and archetypes. So you can help people identify like where it is that they fall into the rubric. But I wonder if you have a quick example, because I'm, even interested in that. And then, can tell us what's in these pages.
Absolutely. So I think, for me, I just have endless moments. I want to speak to both sides of it, of old habitual reactions that are still very present. I see those in moments where I'm not navigating my stress well, where stress is, high, where I have a lot on my mind, a lot to do, where I'm not, taking care of my body, particularly, usually where I'm putting work before me in the mornings. And usually somewhere thereafter, I feel agitation. And what I see in my relationships is that old patterning of kind of pushing people away, yet at the same time, kind of expecting a closeness or a connection. I kind of always think of myself as holding my hand in front of me with the kind of daggers, and saying like, why aren't you coming and hugging me? And right, seeing even in real time, all of those moments where if I'm being really honest, I'm not acting or showing that I need a hug, and or I'm making it really difficult and the environment maybe not even safe for the person to come hug me. So of course, right, I'm not going to get the outcome that I want, but of course, right, I'm able to see all of the role in which I'm playing in terms of creating that lack of connection that I'm actually looking for. And I think the greatest spaces that I continue to see change for me, sustain change, is just my general ability to be different and separate from those I'm in relationship with, to have a different want or need in the moment, to want to spend my day differently, to, want to need to travel or to do something differently, to be inspired on a different creative project, and to feel not only safe to express what it is that I want or need in any given moment, but to still allow myself to feel connected to others, even when I'm taking physical space, or even if I'm in a moment where I'm emotionally maybe turned inward. And I'm just sharing that on the heels of after promoting this book pretty vigorously for several months. On the other side of it, I think I felt what a lot of us feel, right? An emotional exhaustion, an emotional hangover, if you will. And what I noticed is I didn't really want to socialize. I didn't really have much to say, even with my partners with whom I live, friends that I, would come in and visit. Like I found myself very honestly, sharing, I'm kind of feeling like not really up to being out and socializing. And there was a old version of me that, wouldn't have allowed myself to be okay with being the person who was initiating, for lack of a better word, a form of disconnection, right? Of space taking, physical or emotional, in a relationship. So I continue to celebrate those moments where I'm able to not only tolerate different distances in my relationship, whether it's physical distances where we're doing two separate things, or emotional distances, let alone where I'm now able to celebrate, right? Acknowledging when I have that shifting and changing need, because I'm learning, myself as an energetic creature. And while I spend a lot of time, like I described early in our conversation, around a lot of people, right? I've come to realize how different environments, how different social settings, how different even just seasons of my own emotional life shift and make it so that out and people feel now much more energetically overwhelming to me. So I'm able to attune to my own kind of seasons, if you will, in terms of what I want, what I need emotionally, in terms of my own need for solitude or for space, and all the while not holding myself accountable or responsible to just be tending to how those around me are taking or receiving my needs for space. And so I talk, of course, a lot, as I often do. I share a lot of my own relationship journey in this new book, How to Be the Love You Seek. I also share a lot of the practical. Of course, it's very holistically based, a lot of nervous system awareness and nervous system regulatory work, not only for ourselves as individuals, which is definitely the foundation. Though it is a relationship book, of course, the first relationship that we're rebuilding is the relationship with ourselves. And then, of course, I give tools and practices to begin to co-regulate with another, to begin to attune to other individuals and their nervous system cues that and messages that they're sending us, so that ultimately we can create more authentic relationships. Because again, I think the large majority of us, even those of us that are in relationship, even those of us that are well on our journey of healing or of reclamation, if you will, still, I think, have to some extent the deep, like the loneliness, right? The feeling of otherness, the lack of connection that true belonging can give us. Again, because I think it just dates back to patterns and traumas that for many of us have just been passed through generations, though, even hearing of your children and just thinking of future generations. I'm so hopeful because I do see all of this awareness translating into action. I do see how kind of it's spanning out the ripples of change in a very beautiful way. And I'm very hopeful for what will continue to come as more and more of us are having these conversations and creating this change in our own lives.
You're such a huge, huge part of this zeitgeist. And I think that if we, you and I in our respective specialties, like if we were to have remained in the realm of mind-based interventions, right? I mean, there's no one more interested in that than me. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating, these psychological reframes, like how they can jailbreak you in a moment, but integrating that change into evolution, into expansion, into maturation is a body-based experience, right? So to have the capacity to communicate what it is that you need, the vulnerability that you have to hold, the shame, you must visit with in order to ask for what you want, knowing that you can't control whether it will be delivered, whether you'll be made fun of for asking for it. It's a body-based experience. And bringing that conversation into the room actually gives us like a prayer of having healthy relationships, because otherwise we're memorizing scripts. We are easily taking the bait of imagining that our partners need to do differently the moment we have an intolerable, emotion in our own bodies. And I often say, I'm sure you would agree, that like a safe world for me would be where everybody is in touch with what they want and knows how to ask for it, right? Because it's the unsafe world of our childhoods where everything was manipulation and coercion and these covert exchanges that nobody was actually talking about were going on, right? Like, you go to your room because I can't tolerate the feeling in my body, right? Like, no mom ever said that. And that's actually what was happening, like the subtitles beneath the screen. So I'm so grateful for, the ways that you are weaving these domains for us to make material use of in our lives, like lasting actual impact. And I also know that you bring people together to do this work in community. And I think that permission field and that expansion in group work is a part of how, right? Like you quiet the dimensions that say, this isn't worth it. This is too dangerous. Like what you were up to is fine. And just focus on the problems you can actually fix. So yeah, I'd love for you to speak a little bit just about what you've seen is possible in groups that are beginning to orient around this philosophy of personal responsibility and choice and a commitment to self-intimacy.
I want to go back to, because I think there can be such a quiet confidence that we gain, right? When we can be in that embodied space of empowerment or of self-power. So even like you're saying, right? Being totally honest, if we have this beautiful world, I love this idea too, right? I am endorsing this future worldview of the safest world is where we're just honest, right? We're able to say and be who we are. Because then what that provides the world around us, our relationships included, of course, right, is, as I would call it, information. Right? Information, right? If you're hearing from someone, if you're seeing from someone authentically, as it is the case for them, and if at the same time you're in your embodied space of self-trust and self-confidence, connected to your intuition, which will always guide you, then somewhere along the way, you will find your way into the relationship with this now informational space of this other person, right? That is aligned for you. You will have the confidence to navigate that, whether it's continuing in the dynamic as it is, whether it's changing the dynamic, empowering yourself, of course, to initiate that change, or whether it's ending the dynamic and separating or evolving into a different type of relationship. And that's a confidence, right? We don't have to put the direct or indirect manipulative pressure on someone else. And even if we're not saying it, they can feel it. And let's be honest, no adult likes to feel the pressure to be different. We can just be and let everyone around us be, and then use that as information to determine, right, what happens next for us or what's aligned for us. And so for me, as I very publicly on the Instagram platform, before a community that is now the Self-Healer Circle existed, I was gifted. So going online and being the holistic psychologist that day, whenever it was in 2018 that I decided to do that, was just as much of a function or played just as much as of a role in my individual healing as it did in my desire, or what was becoming a passion for me to share this holistic model of wellness with other people. And what I mean when I say that is as I was shifting and changing dynamics, right, and being my own information in the world and taking others' information, I was seeing a lot of shifts in relationships, objective ones where I was creating boundaries or distance from relationships that up until that point I'd imagined I'd have forever. So really simply, I was starting to feel the loneliness, a new loneliness, a more authentically driven loneliness around the desire to be around like-minded individuals who were, on their own journey of healing, who had access to this information, who like me were interested in talking like you about this because I'm fascinated by it. I want to talk about this all of the time with other individuals who want to as well. So when I went online and I was gifted with, near universal resonance from, the very beginnings of me posting, seeing individuals hitting like from around the world, I was starting to feel a little less alone. I was starting to get that, affirmation, confirmation of, oh my gosh, Nicole, there are other people out there that are thinking about this, that are doing the same work, that are feeling similar to you. And I started to feel how healing, and at the same time, read scientifically how healing community and relationships inherently are for us as individuals. So learning, right, for me, then that natural transition was, let me experiment and explore. Is there a way that we can do this in a more structured way, in a membership form, right, where I can deliver content and have a support team around me to create the safe space for a community of individuals internationally to join together, right, and to learn how to be themselves. And for me, kind of coupling those two things remains to this day such an integral part of my own healing experience, being within the community. It's not just that I, create the content and quote unquote run the community, if you will. I am just as much an integrated member in that community. I'm just as excited when we have outside presenters come in for workshops to be in attendance, because I too am gaining not only the resources and the tools, I'm gaining the emotional healing that comes with being in a group of individuals and hearing and sharing your own personal narratives, right? So that for me was life-changing, remains life-changing. Individuals who join the community, of course, join for many different reasons, whether it's to access the resources, right? The actual content that we put out on different topics every month. And the larger majority, if I'm being honest, are coming for the community, to connect with others, to be in this conversation, to begin to explore and experiment in a new safe space, how to be themselves in a new way. And it's just been such a inspirational and such a beautiful experience to continue to witness the community grow, the individual members in the community grow, and just to hear and, witness all of the transformations that have come, almost pulling this all together, right? When we couple the readiness with the resources, right? With the space and the access, what true transformation that can happen when we feel empowered because all of that has come together.
Amen. Yes. And, I'm feeling into belonging being the deepest need that we have, many disparate paths to pursue. And I relate to that. And I, honestly even feel that from a conversation like this, having you as an ally, I feel a little bit more like I belong in the world. And I think so many of us who are on this hero or heroine's journey, we will confront that core belief that is, I should never have incarnated, right? Like, I don't belong in this body. Like, I don't belong here. What am I doing here? And to allow that belief to rest in a safe nest, as it incubates like into, this beautiful creature. It's what we came here for, is that journey, I think. So thank you. Thank you for doing this work. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for bringing all of your beautiful flavors to this conversation and the disruption of, what is this construct of mental illness, mental health, and mental wellness. And how is it that the whole framing of it as mental is part of the, part of the challenge, and that we're here to meet in broadening the conversation. So thank you, woman. I'm so grateful. And we'll make sure to have, your resources available in the show notes. And I really look forward to the next time that our paths cross.
Oh gosh, same. I cannot reflect more gratitude right back your way, Kelly. I mean, truly, you have been such a part of my journey from such an early time before I even had the opportunity to physically connect with you in real time. So this has just been a true honor, and I am continuing. I've chills saying it. I'm not going anywhere. I'm continuing on this path. I believe so deeply in it. I've found what I thought was just a concept for a very long time in the form of a passion or a purpose. I didn't think again that I had that genetic chip. I thought, yeah, I do things, but I never really felt inspired in the way that I do now. And just, seeing people like yourself, the work you're putting out, the communities you're creating, it's so inspirational. And it's just, like I said, it brings me just such hope for where we're going. And I'm here for it. So thank you again.
I love it.